In this presentation, I want to focus on the principles of personal data protection. I have pre-drawn some squares, and I think that's the way you should look at it. I always try to cluster the principles in four blocks. Four blocks you'll see, and I have to add a central block, which I'm going to do right now. And there's a an underlying, principle that counts for all clusters at the same time. The central idea, and it is probably come up in some other presentations I'm going to make, is the idea of control. When discussing the actors in the personal data protection context, control is a central idea. Why? Because the data subject provides information to the data controller, and the data controller is the one who is supposed to be in control of that data on behalf of the data subject. So control is in any case a central element. Then a first cluster of principles is based around the purpose. Other ways to call it are the finality, principle, or the goal. Under this cluster you have that there has to be a purpose. The purpose has to be legitimate. The purpose has to be disclosed. The data has to be processed within the limits of that purpose, which also means that only data that is relevant for that purpose can be processed. The information has to be accurate and up-to-date so it can serve that purpose, and the data can only be retained for as long as the purpose is served. So those are some of the elements that go under the purpose principle. The second one is a legitimacy. Legitimacy means that there are good grounds to process that data, and there are two approaches to, or two subdivisions of that legitimacy. The first subdivision is excuse me, the subdivision of on a risk basis. You have the general grounds for or basis for legitimacy. You have the specific basis for legitimacy when you are processing special categories of data. That's something we're going to go into in another presentation. And there's the specific grounds or basis for legitimacy when transferring personal data to third countries or countries outside the European Economic Area. That's enough for now. Focusing on the general basis or grounds for legitimacy, you can say that the first one always comes to consent of the data subject, whether explicit or implied, and another one is a democratic interest, or a democratically valued interest, sorry. And there you have interests that are specified in the law or in statutes, and otherwise there's a catch-all clause that says, well, if you have a legitimate interest and it doesn't invade privacy too much, go ahead. A third principle is transparency. Transparency has two different lineouts. The one is the transparency towards the data subject. The other one is the transparency towards the public, and it is generally set out via the Data Protection Authority or the Data Protection Commissioner. Via the data subject or towards the data subject, transparency is generally called or referred to as the privacy notice. Okay, so all of these things we're going to go into more detail in several other presentations, but this is for now. Transparency. And a fourth principle is, in my opinion, organization. You will have people who make some more principles out of this, but I think organization is a principle in itself. And this means that you process personal data in a secure way and keep it confidential. That you organize yourself to meet the data subject's rights that are granted in the law. It also means that you get people in your organization accountable. So those are the big lines of the organization, where security and confidentiality then again can be split up in the organization itself and when working with contractors and when transferring to third countries. So that's the big layout of the principles, and then there's one overall principle, if you want, and that's proportionality. Proportionality has an influence on all the four other principles with regard to purpose. It kind of states or comes up in the request for relevance. Only relevant data can be used, so you have to make a proportionality test towards the purpose. With regard to legitimacy, the proportionality generally comes up when measuring at what level you have to go find your legitimate interest. Do you have to get the consent, or can you find it elsewhere? And especially in the non-explicit measures or non-explicit interests that you want to set against privacy interests of the data subjects, proportionality is very important. Thirdly, in transparency, the more privacy invasive your processing is, the better the privacy notice has to be, the more you have to inform the data subject, so as to make sure that the data subject is in control when he consents or doesn't have any expectations that don't meet the actual processing. And proportionality also comes into the organization. The more sensitive the personal data is, the more you have to make efforts towards security and confidentiality, the more you have to stress that data subjects' rights are respected, the more you have to make sure that everybody in your organization is accountable for things. So, as a summary, the principles are very clear. They are around the element of control. They are always governed by a proportionality test, and they are 1. Purpose. 2. Legitimacy. 3. Transparency. 4. Organization. So we're going to work those elements out in different presentations, but that's for another time.